Hey everyone, my name is Eric Bull, and my grant proposal is on assessing seasonality and methods in the effectiveness of Gambel oak management. So this builds off of my fire regime presentation a few weeks ago on Gambel oak in Colorado, and some of the research that I found there really pointed to the need for this study. Um, and I can give a little bit of a overview of the issues here. The first is that Gambel oak is notoriously hard to control. It resprouts from the roots, so it rebounds really quickly after a natural disturbance like fire or any man-made control effort. There's a lot of uh, reference in the research to combinations of control efforts or rapid succession of them in repeated years to improve success, which is not too surprising. But the research tends to conclude that almost any control regime wears off in ineffectiveness after 10 to 15 years, which some land managers might find acceptable and some might not. But the overall body of research on the control effectiveness with Gambel oak is pretty limited. A lot of it came from the 70s and 80s, and it seems to me like any addition to this body of knowledge would be really useful to land managers who are doing this work today. And one final point here is that Gambel oak exists in many different ecosystems, which on one hand might make doing this kind of research a bit challenging and trying to draw generalizations across a really wide array of sites. But it also speaks to the need for any advancement in our knowledge here because Gambel oak is being controlled for so many different reasons across different ecosystem types. And I think any advancement in our knowledge there would be very valuable. So the research question at hand here is there a mix of seasonality, chronosequence, and treatment options that works best to control Gambel oak? Obviously, that's a pretty big question, a pretty complex one. I don't think that any study like this could aim to authoritatively answer every element here, but I do think it's very reasonable through the methods that I'll outline here in a minute that we can come away with very real takeaways on some things that are working, not working, or just working better than others to control Gambel oak. So as far as the hypothesis, I broke this out into a few different segments here, and the first two are that the repeated treatment of Gambel oak in consecutive years and combinations of different treatments will improve the success of control, and that results will vary a bit across different ecosystem types. Now, those may not seem too surprising. They're very frequently supported by existing research. But I think it'll be really interesting exactly sort of what shakes out of the data. The third bullet here might be the most interesting one to me personally, and it's the seasonality question, the question of when these methods ought to be applied to be the most effective. And my hypothesis is that treatment, generally speaking, during late summer when the oak carbohydrate stores in the root systems are low because of the growing of leaves and the growing of the tree, will improve success. But I think that's a pretty complex question. I could certainly imagine scenarios where different treatment options or different sequences of treatment options uh, can have different mixes of seasonality that work best. And I would really welcome all feedback on this part of the hypothesis in particular. I'd be curious what people think. So a little bit of background on Gambel ecosystems. As I mentioned before, there are a wide range of different ecosystem types that contain Gambel across the Southwest and northern Mexico. And because the more northern and southern ranges have some very kind of different characteristics. For the purposes of this study, we'll be focusing on the Colorado and Utah region. And just a really quick overview of the kinds of treatment options that we're talking about here. Mechanical treatment, prescribed burns, and herbicide application are the three primary control agents that I'm looking at in this study and that are most often cited in the research. There are a lot of different ways to apply each of those, and in different combinations with each other, and that's a lot of what we're trying to get at here. I would mention that there is some reference to a fourth option of control, which is shoot browsing by goats, but that doesn't seem widespread enough that it made sense to include here. So as far as methods, a very brief overview here. The idea of this study is not to conduct an experimental or a single experimental plot in one location, but rather to survey a bunch of existing plots where this treatment has already happened, and ideally data collection has already happened to some extent. So the first step here is to find 20 to 30 or more stands of Gambel oak that have had multi-year treatment applications in the last 10 to 20 years. And that date range is specifically so there's enough time to really gauge success and gauge to what extent regrowth is happening. And ideally, we're looking for stands where some amount of subsequent monitoring has been recorded. And realistically, I think finding these stands will be a big job. I think it will require a lot of working the phones, talking to federal and state land agencies, as well as private landowners who might have done this kind of work. Our next step there is to, as best as possible, normalize all the monitoring data into consistent measurements that can be analyzed. And then over the course of 2 to 5 years, conducting field measurements in some of these stands to fill holes in the data and to follow up with more regeneration sampling. So for my next slide here, I took a bit of an unusual approach. I gave a snapshot of essentially a spreadsheet. I just wanted to give folks a bit of a view of what kind of data that I'm really trying to collect here, given that we're surveying a lot of existing sites. So I can just walk through some of the columns in this sheet. And the first, obviously, is all of the sites at hand. The second would be some kind of code for the ecosystem type that we're talking about, whether it's a pure Gambel stand, Gambel alongside pinyon juniper, or something else. I found at least 6 ecosystem types that we could probably identify as our primaries, though we could certainly get more detailed than that if we found it useful based on the site selection that we had. The next pieces of data are whether or not herbicide, mechanical treatment, or prescribed burn were applied as a part of the control regime. Then the combination of treatments that happened over the course of the regime, and then the seasonality, over years 1, 2, 3, when the actual control effort was applied. Then the years of treatment, both the raw number and so the sequence of sort of what years control was happening, in what years control was happening. And then the final 2 columns showing the percent cover of Gambel pre-treatment, and then the percent cover of Gambel, through the years of the post-treatment years of monitoring. So I hope that makes sense. I think the final data set would no doubt have a lot of these columns expanded into many more columns to sort of get each individual piece of data in there. But I hope this gives a bit of an overview of what I'm really trying to achieve here. And then as far as the final results and deliverables, I think we're really talking about 2 things. And the first one might be the most obvious, and that's various analysis, isolating a lot of these individual measures as best as possible, trying to show what season different methods or different combination of methods are most effective in, if there are specific combinations or sequences, number of years of treatment that tend to show better results. I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. And I do think there are a handful of different ways you could present the data to show that. The second item here might actually be the one that I find personally more exciting. And I think as a byproduct of doing all this work, We could create an index of test sites with very clear, identifiable ecosystem characteristics that can serve as a real-world database for land managers of case studies and reference areas to help gather a bit of knowledge before conducting Gambel oak management in the field. That's the kind of thing that I could not really find evidence of existing today, and I think would be really useful to land managers in the region. So here are my references. Thanks for listening, and I really look forward to seeing everyone's feedback.